Captain Alex Voss was many things: brave, loyal, skilled, but never had he been prepared for the chaos that was about to unfold. The first human diplomatic mission to the Cruzarians, a species revered for their precision and emotional detachment, had been anticipated for months. Humanity had only recently stepped into the galactic community, and every alien race had watched them with suspicion, some even fear. The Cruzarians, in particular, viewed all emotions as a dangerous source of disorder. They were a cold, calculated species, their society perfectly organized to prevent the rise of instability, which they believed emotions invariably brought. For them, logic and discipline were the only means of survival. Emotions had no place in their world. Voss's ship entered Cruzarian space, a sleek, silver vessel that gleamed like a bullet against the backdrop of deep space. As they neared the Cruzarian capital, an enormous city that stretched across the entire surface of a barren moon, Voss couldn't help but feel a slight tension in the air. His crew, highly trained for diplomatic missions, were on edge, their usual joviality replaced by silent anticipation. They knew the importance of this mission, not just for the future of humanity, but for how the galaxy would perceive them. The Cruzarians were influential, respected, and feared by every species they encountered. To fail this mission would mean not just a diplomatic disaster, but a serious setback for humanity's standing in the galaxy. The first meeting was held in a cavernous, pristine hall inside a towering citadel. Cruzarian delegates, their faces as cold and expressionless as their homeworld, greeted the humans with an air of distaste. Despite their lack of emotion, there was an undeniable sense of superiority in the way they carried themselves. They were the epitome of control, their every word measured, their posture unwavering. The meeting began with formal introductions, and Voss was on high alert, knowing the subtle nuances of alien diplomacy could mean the difference between success and failure. For the first hour, everything went according to plan. Voss and his team presented humanity's peaceful intentions, outlining their desire for mutual cooperation and trade. The Cruzarians remained quiet, occasionally nodding or speaking in neutral tones, their voices betraying no emotion. Then, without warning, something inside Voss shifted. He couldn't explain it at first. It was like a sudden, pressing weight against his mind, as though a fog had settled in his thoughts. He could hear the Cruzarians' voices, yes, but beneath their words, there was something else, a low hum, a pulse of feeling, like a thread connecting their minds. He could sense their unease, their growing anxiety, something that made the air in the room feel heavier. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. Voss tried to ignore it, focusing on the ongoing conversation. But the more he spoke, the more he became aware of this strange presence. His thoughts were no longer his own. He felt the emotions of those around him, not just their surface-level reactions, but the deep, often contradictory feelings hidden within. Fear. Anger. Confusion. A deep, buried loneliness. It was as if their shields had cracked open just for a moment, allowing him to see the emotional wreckage beneath their calm exteriors. Voss's hand trembled slightly, and his mouth went dry. He tried to steady himself, but the sensations kept coming, waves of emotion crashing into him with such intensity that it was almost unbearable. The room, once sterile and emotionless, now felt suffocating. Voss's pulse quickened as he fought to control himself. He had to push these feelings back. He had to maintain his composure. But it was impossible. The more he tried to block it out, the stronger the flood of emotions became. The Cruzarians, who had been perfectly calm just moments before, were now in a state of quiet turmoil. Voss could feel their fear rising, their confusion growing as they tried to comprehend the source of this unexplainable sensation. "Captain Voss," one of the Cruzarians said, his voice slightly strained, "are you feeling well?" His eyes, though perfectly still, seemed to betray a hint of concern. "You appear troubled." Voss blinked, momentarily stunned. He had no idea how to respond. He had never experienced anything like this before. He wasn't sick, and yet he was overwhelmed by emotions that were not his own. He wanted to speak, to say something that would reassure them, but his mind was too clouded. The sensations were overpowering. As the minutes dragged on, the feelings grew even more intense. Voss could feel the sheer weight of the Cruzarians' collective emotional repression, years of buried fear, guilt, and sorrow that they had never acknowledged, all converging on him at once. It was as if they were all secretly screaming inside, but their carefully constructed shells kept them silent. He could hear their cries for freedom, their deep, unspoken wishes for release, and it was too much. The overwhelming tide of emotions seemed to crack the brittle armor of their control, and he knew they were beginning to lose their grip. The Cruzarian delegate who had addressed him earlier, the leader of the group, a being of remarkable intellect and coldness, stared at him with narrowed eyes. There was no mistaking it now, something was wrong. His perfectly calculated demeanor faltered, his eyes flickering with a brief moment of panic. In that moment, Voss realized the truth. His ability to sense emotions, to feel the raw undercurrents of those around him, was not just some passing sensation. He had inadvertently tapped into something much deeper, a power that these emotionless beings could not fathom, let alone defend against. "Captain," the delegate said, his voice thick with barely contained anxiety, "we must end this meeting. Now." Voss stood there, his mind swirling with confusion, the empathy he had unintentionally unleashed rippling through the room. The Cruzarians had always believed that their society was invulnerable, nothing could disrupt their order. But they had not anticipated this, the sheer force of human empathy, raw and unrefined, threatening to tear apart the delicate balance they had maintained for eons. As the meeting collapsed into chaos, Voss realized something that chilled him to his core. The galaxy, everything he knew, was on the verge of change, and humanity had unwittingly become the catalyst. The Cruzarians, for the first time in their history, were faced with something they could not control, the human heart. And it terrified them. Voss felt an odd pressure building inside his chest as the meeting progressed. At first, it was subtle, like a faint whisper at the edge of his consciousness, something he couldn't quite place. The Cruzarians spoke in their calm, methodical tones, detailing their technological advances, their political structure, and their history of emotional suppression. To the human mind, it was all impressive, yet unsettling. The sheer absence of emotion, the coldness in their voices, felt like a vacuum, draining the life from the room. But Voss wasn't just hearing their words. He began to feel something else, something that defied explanation. As the Cruzarian ambassador, Soft Kryl, droned on about the peace their society had maintained for centuries, Voss suddenly became acutely aware of the undercurrent of distress beneath Kryl's flawless exterior. It wasn't obvious, nothing physical changed. The ambassador's voice never wavered, his posture remained perfect, but Voss could feel it. A sharp, nagging pain in the back of his mind. A growing sense of fear. Panic, hidden deep within the ambassador's mind, like a barely controlled tremor threatening to shatter the illusion of calm. At first, Voss thought it was his own imagination. But then it spread. He felt the same sense of discomfort in the other Cruzarian delegates, each one seemingly perfect on the outside, yet their minds were fraying at the edges. He could hear their thoughts, their deepest fears, even their unspoken regrets. He felt the suffocating weight of their emotional repression, the intense pressure they were under to maintain the cold, rational facade. It was as if the very act of suppressing emotions had created a festering wound inside each of them, a deep unease that they could never acknowledge, never address. Voss wanted to speak, to address it, but he found he could not. His mind felt clouded, his thoughts slipping away. He tried to focus on the conversation, to return to the diplomatic formalities, but the emotions he was feeling overwhelmed him. He had no control. It was like a floodgate had opened in his mind, and he was drowning in the feelings of the Cruzarians. Their collective distress seeped into his consciousness, merging with his own thoughts until he couldn't tell where his mind ended and theirs began. He gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady himself, but the wave of emotion continued to crash over him. He could feel the Cruzarians' fear, but there was something else, a deeper, more primal force that began to make itself known. Voss could sense their desperation, the overwhelming need for escape. They feared something they could not control, something that was starting to grow within their society. And then, in an instant, it hit him. It wasn't just that he could sense their emotions, It was as if he had suddenly become their emotions. He could no longer distinguish between his own thoughts and theirs. It was like his mind was tethered to theirs, his consciousness woven into the fabric of their own. And the more he experienced this connection, the more he realized something terrifying: empathy, the very thing that humans had always prided themselves on, was the force that was causing this disturbance. Humans, with their ability to empathize, to emotionally connect with others in ways that transcended logic, were the antithesis of everything the Cruzarians had worked to build. Their society had been founded on the idea that emotional detachment was the key to stability and peace. But here was Voss, a single human, breaking down their defenses without even trying. His empathy was like a weapon, a force they couldn't contain or explain. By now, the Cruzarians were growing visibly uncomfortable. Their bodies were still, their faces unchanged, but the subtle shifts in their behavior were becoming more apparent. The slight flicker of their eyes, the stiffness in their posture, the way they looked at each other as if seeking reassurance. Their walls were starting to crack, their emotional equilibrium threatened by something they had never encountered before: raw, unfiltered human empathy. Voss tried to speak, to apologize, to somehow distance himself from what was happening, but the words stuck in his throat. He could feel their reactions more intensely now, every thought, every fear, every ounce of anxiety they had buried deep within themselves. The air felt thick with it. It was suffocating. And then something else happened. The Cruzarians' emotional turmoil began to spread. It wasn't just Voss feeling their distress anymore. The entire room, the entire building, seemed to be resonating with the growing wave of emotion. Voss realized, with horror, that the very act of empathizing with them was causing their emotional contagion to spiral out of control. The Cruzarian delegate across from him, a woman named Olin, clutched her chest, her breath shallow. Voss could hear her thoughts, clearer than before: "We can't keep this under control. It's too much. It's too much, it's breaking me." Her calm facade shattered for just a moment, and in that brief instant, Voss saw it, the cracks in the perfect structure of their society. The cold, emotionless Cruzarians, with their strict control, had created a prison within their own minds. And now, that prison was starting to collapse. The delegates' thoughts turned to chaos. Voss felt their collective fear, their growing sense of panic. They were no longer trying to hide it. They were overwhelmed, drowning in their own emotions, and Voss couldn't stop it. The flood of empathy continued to surge, and in that moment, he realized the true horror of what he had unleashed. It wasn't just a diplomatic disaster. The Cruzarians weren't just uncomfortable, they were broken. The very foundation of their society was at risk. The delicate balance they had maintained for centuries was being torn apart by a single human's ability to feel. Voss stumbled back, shaking. His crew, confused and alarmed, looked on in horror. They had no idea what was happening. They had no idea that empathy, the very thing that made humans unique, was the weapon that had shattered the Cruzarians' perfect world. As the chaos escalated, Voss realized the truth: the Cruzarians were not afraid of humans because of their technology, their strength, or even their unpredictability. They were afraid because humanity had something they could never understand or control: the power of empathy. As the meeting dragged on, Voss struggled to maintain his composure. It was becoming increasingly difficult to focus on the task at hand. The constant barrage of emotions, the waves of distress crashing against his mental walls, were too overwhelming. He tried to push it away, but it kept coming back, each wave more intense than the last. The Cruzarians, despite their best efforts, were slipping. Their facade was crumbling, and Voss could feel it in his bones. The moment of true chaos came unexpectedly. As Soth Kryl outlined their society's achievements, how they had eradicated all violence, how they had eliminated personal conflicts, the Cruzarians' words faltered for just an instant. That brief moment of weakness was all it took. Voss couldn't control himself. His mind, already stretched to its limit, lashed out involuntarily, reaching into the ambassador's consciousness, pulling at the frayed edges of Kryl's carefully constructed self-control. In an instant, it was as if a dam had broken. A flood of emotions poured into Voss's mind, a tidal wave of despair, anxiety, and suffocating loneliness. It was as if the Kruzarian society had been built on a lie that Voss had just unwittingly exposed. The terror within KRYL's mind was so intense that it reverberated through the room, infecting the others around him. For the first time, the Kruzarian's calm, emotionless demeanor cracked. One delegate's breath became shallow, another's hands trembled, and yet another began to sweat, something that had never happened in all the recorded history of their race. The delegation was in turmoil. The Kruzarians had mastered the art of emotional suppression to such an extent that their bodies had forgotten how to even react to emotion properly. They had become so disconnected from their own feelings that the sudden onslaught of raw, unfiltered human emotion, amplified by Voss's unintentional intrusion, shattered their carefully built world. It wasn't just the emotional impact that unnerved them, it was the fact that Voss had done it so effortlessly, without even meaning to. His connection to their emotions was so deep, so instinctive, that it seemed impossible. The Kruzarians, beings who had eradicated all traces of their emotional past, found themselves helpless in the face of this alien ability. Voss, for his part, had no idea what was happening. All he knew was that the flood of emotions, their sharp, visceral quality, was too much to handle. He tried to focus, to block it out, but it felt as though his mind was being torn apart. He could feel every Kruzarian's fear, their deep-rooted shame, their internal conflict. It was as if they had lived for millennia trying to outrun their emotions, burying them deep within themselves, and now, they were exposed, raw and unprotected. KRYL stood still, his face now a mask of confusion and fear. The ambassador had always prided himself on his ability to control his inner state, yet he found himself at the mercy of a human, a species that the Kruzarians had once regarded as primitive and inferior. The emotional strain began to show in small ways, his hands clenched at his sides, his breathing became erratic. The Kruzarians had been trained to suppress even the smallest sign of weakness, but now they were failing, exposed to the very thing they had spent millennia avoiding. In the following moments, the room descended into chaos. Several delegates tried to distance themselves from Voss, instinctively recoiling from the raw, unrestrained emotions radiating off of him. Others began to break down mentally, unable to handle the tidal wave of empathy that seemed to suffocate them. The calm, orderly society they had built for centuries was cracking, the foundation of their entire civilization suddenly vulnerable to the alien force that was humanity's greatest weapon. The diplomats scrambled to regain control, their usual calm, calculated movements turning frantic. Voss, still overwhelmed, could barely make sense of what was happening. He had no idea how to stop it, how to turn off the flood of emotions that had taken over his mind. The Kruzarians were unprepared for something like this. They had spent centuries perfecting emotional control, and yet here was a human who, without even trying, had exposed the deep fissures in their society. The Kruzarians' once perfect world, built on emotional suppression and control, was now at risk of falling apart. As the panic spread, the situation turned critical. Kruzarian security forces rushed into the room, their cold, emotionless faces betraying the anxiety they had never before experienced. Voss was being pulled away, forcibly separated from the delegates who now seemed desperate to restore order. It was clear that something irreversible had happened. The Kruzarians had always viewed emotions as a flaw, something to be eradicated for the greater good, but in that moment, it became clear that they had underestimated the power of the very thing they had suppressed for so long. Voss was ushered out of the chamber, his mind still reeling from the emotional assault. He could hear their thoughts, their panic, even as they tried to regain control. It was as if their entire social structure had been built on a lie, and he had exposed the truth with nothing more than his ability to feel. He had unwittingly shattered the foundation of their society. And yet, as much as he felt the weight of the chaos he had caused, there was a part of him that couldn't deny the truth of what had happened. The Kruzarians, for all their technological prowess and emotional control, were fragile in a way that humanity was not. They were not immune to the force of empathy, and in that moment, Voss realized that this was why humans terrified every alien species in the galaxy. Their ability to feel, to connect with others, was something that no amount of technology, no amount of emotional control, could ever counter. As the room quieted and the Cruzarians attempted to restore order, Voss couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this was just the beginning. Something deeper had been unleashed. The emotional rift was now a part of him, and he had no idea how far it would reach. He could only hope that humanity's presence in the galaxy wouldn't be seen as a threat, but as an unintentional catalyst for change. But in the back of his mind, he knew that what had just occurred would change the galaxy forever. The Cruzarians, who had prided themselves on their unflinching control, were now crumbling under the weight of something they couldn't understand. Voss had unwittingly unlocked a floodgate, exposing them to the very thing they had worked so hard to suppress: empathy, the one weapon that had always been their greatest fear. But it wasn't just Voss who was affected anymore. His crew, too, began to feel the ripple effects. The alien emotions they had been unknowingly absorbing were now beginning to seep into their minds, altering their behavior, their perceptions. They were no longer mere observers, they had become part of the chaos. It was only a matter of time before the entire room descended into full-blown pandemonium. Delegates who had previously spoken in calm, precise tones now found themselves speechless, their minds overwhelmed by an emotional contagion they could neither understand nor control. Voss, desperate to regain control of the situation, tried to shut down the empathy that had overtaken him, but it was futile. The connection he had formed with the Cruzarians was too deep, too ingrained in his consciousness to sever. As he struggled to keep himself grounded, a terrifying realization washed over him. The Cruzarians weren't just afraid of their emotions. They were terrified of humanity's ability to empathize because it exposed them to something they had long feared: the fragility of their own minds. In their pursuit of logic, they had severed their connection to their true selves, creating a society that was held together by sheer willpower, but one that was always on the brink of collapse. The very foundation of their peace was built on the suppression of emotion, and Voss's unintentional breach had shattered that fragile equilibrium. With the room descending into chaos, Voss finally managed to raise his voice. His words were shaky at first, but he forced himself to speak. "We didn't mean to cause this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But what you're feeling, it's not a weakness. It's part of what makes us human." The Cruzarians recoiled as if struck, their logical minds unable to process the truth in Voss's statement. The more Voss tried to explain, the more he realized that what he was saying had no impact on them. Logic and reason had long since ceased to hold any sway over their panicked minds. His words fell on deaf ears, drowned by the overwhelming surge of emotions now coursing through the room. It was then that Voss understood the true nature of the fear that had gripped the galaxy's other species. Humans were terrifying not because they were physically superior or technologically advanced, though they were, in many ways. No, humans were terrifying because they could feel. They could reach across boundaries, connect with others, and expose the deepest vulnerabilities of the most powerful species in the galaxy. They could see the cracks in the facade of even the most perfect societies, and they could shatter them with a single glance, a single word. The Cruzarians, in their quest for perfect order, had forgotten something fundamental: their own humanity. And now, faced with the raw, untamed force of human empathy, they had nowhere to hide. Their perfectly constructed society, built on emotional suppression, was no match for the explosive power of human connection. But the true horror, Voss realized, was that the Cruzarians were not alone in their fear. Across the galaxy, in every corner of the galaxy's advanced civilizations, there were whispers, rumors of humanity's strange power. The ability to feel, to connect, to empathize, was a force that no species could truly understand, and for that reason, it terrified them. The more they saw of humanity, the more they feared that one day, it would be their undoing. As the delegation collapsed into utter chaos, Voss knew they would never forget this moment. The Cruzarians would never again look at humans the same way. And neither would any other species in the galaxy. Humanity had shown them a new kind of power, one that could not be measured in weapons or technology, but in the depth of the soul, in the capacity to understand and feel the suffering and the joy of others. The situation had spiraled beyond control, but Voss could not help but feel a strange sense of victory. He had proven that the true strength of humanity did not lie in their advanced technology or their ability to conquer. No, it lay in their ability to empathize, to connect with others on a deeply emotional level. And that was something no species, no matter how advanced, could ever hope to suppress. As the Cruzarians reeled, attempting to regain their composure, Voss and his crew quietly exited the chamber. The galaxy would never be the same. The human race, for better or worse, had shaken the foundations of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations. What had begun as a simple diplomatic mission had turned into something far more profound, a revelation that would haunt the galaxy for centuries to come. And it was just the beginning.